This is Transparency, a podcast by Gender Dysphoria Alliance, hosted by Aaron Kimberly and Aaron Terrell. Each week we'll be joined by people who have personal or professional experience with gender dysphoria and physical transition. We'll also discuss how our trans experiences relate to the concept of gender identity. Join us for a compassionate yet heterodox approach to the question of trans. All right, welcome back to Transparency, everyone. We are delighted to be joined once again by Phil Illy. Phil's got a book that either just dropped or is about to, based on when this ultimately releases. And we're excited to have you back and talk more about your kind of central thesis, which is that autoheterosexuality is the kind of an umbrella that encompasses both the male phenomenon of autogynephilia and this more lesser known and more hotly disputed autoandrophilia in females. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Has the book been released now, or is it just about to? What's the release date?
The release date is June 13th. I've started posting it on Twitter just because I wrote it so that people would read it. And so I'm making it publicly accessible, to a large degree, even before the release date, just because I just feel it's so urgent that the most common cause of gender dysphoria, I mean, in my perspective, this is the most common cause. And that if that is the case, it's important that people know that as soon as possible, because there's people making irreversible medical decisions every single day. And so I just want the people that are making those decisions to be as fully informed about their condition.
Mm-hmm. That's an honorable goal. And my hope is that, those that have transitioned because I agree with you. And I think that has been well established in literature that autosexuality, I mean, you're coining that term, but that autosexuality is the primary driver for transition. But I think the vast majority of transitioners don't know that. And I just hope that people don't, when they come to that realization, because I think that reckoning is coming, when they come to that realization, I hope there aren't people that regret their choice.
Right. Yeah. And I think there will be some, but I also hope when that happens that they keep in mind that if it was autosexuality causing their decision to transition, that they were being driven by strong internal forces. And so it's understandable that they made those decisions. And it's just that it was a societal failing that it wasn't being explained to them clearly.
I agree.
Yeah. I had a lot of similar thoughts when we went into this project. Is when we do this, it's like we're exposing a lot of things that people don't want to think about, and I was kind of weighing that. It's like we could potentially save people from making decisions, not save them, not to be all savioristic about it, but like putting information in front of people. Either it can be helpful for those who have not gone down that path and don't necessarily need to, or want to have more or should have had more information before they made kind of irreversible decisions. And then on the other hand, there is that concern. It's like, are we talking about things that could potentially trigger people, to their entire kind of like their sense of self and their, very major life decisions and, bodily choices that they've made. It's a tough thing to grapple with. Is like, but ultimately, I decided that, the truth and the honesty of all of this is more important than potentially saving feelings that have already been
right.
Or yeah. And a lot of times, people like Anne Lawrence, for example, would have said, I would have made this decision over and over again, knowing what I know now, like, and then there are others who are like, oh, had I known that this is what was driving it, I wouldn't have done this. So the more information, the better, because it can, go either way.
And the type of information that you're offering, Phil, is so nuanced and just matter of fact. You're not bringing a lot of emotion into it. You're just examining it as a phenomenon. And I think that is so needed in this whole thing, because the concept of AGP gets used in one of two ways. It either gets used as a slur, that it's such a shallow understanding of what the phenomenon is, and it ends up getting used as a slur towards trans women, and then trans women respond to that like, well, no, I'm not just a sick pervert, and so AGP therefore doesn't exist. And I think for decades now, these warring camps have been warring over a definition of what it is that is so
Mhm.
cartoonish and distorted and and shallow that it's I think that's why it's never resolved. This battle's been going on for decades, and so I think what you're bringing and what Dr. Bailey has tried to bring to the conversation in the past too, but writing his book, is a very just sort of cool, rational examination of a phenomenon.
Yeah. And I agree with you that it has been the version of it that people use in discourse when they talk about autogynephilia is so cartoonish and wrong. Like when I first saw it described by feminists, I didn't have any idea that it described me. Um, and so I went many more years without, taking that possibility seriously. Um, and yeah, and people have this simplistic two-dimensional version of autogynephilia that they talk about, but it's really complex because it's ultimately a kind of love. And, when you're trying to put love into words, it can be very hard because it's one of those like squishy human feeling things. And so, yeah, that's why I tried in my book to be nuanced and describe it accurately and all the ins and outs and the subtleties to it, as best I could.
And I think that's one of the reasons why people we've got a difficult time, or people are having a difficult time accepting that there is a female equivalent of this, because I think they're thinking of it in the very hypersexual, target oriented kind of. And this is where I think I disagree with Bailey on this category, or in this topic a lot. I think the crux of it being is, so he's saying that autoandrophilia can't exist in females because paraphilias don't exist in females. And I'm wondering if we're on that basis making a categorical error, is that when you describe autogynephilia, a lot of it is it's much more about, it's like this romantic pull, right? It's not just a sexual act, it's not just sexual behaviors. It's a, there's a lot of other feelings tied into it, right? And so I think if you're going to look at that, at the equivalent in females, it's again going to look much less sexual, and it's going to look much more sentimental and romantic, because that's kind of how female sexual orientation works, right? And so it's not going to look that. So I think, yeah, you're not going to find autoandrophilia if you're looking for a paraphilia. No, you're not, because it's not going to look like that. It's going to look like a desire to recreate what you're attracted to internally, and that is, you're going to find that in both sexes. Well, you're going to find autosexuality, I believe, in both sexes, but it's going to look differently between males and females. And that's
Yeah.
where Bailey keeps saying, well, if it looks differently, it's not the same thing. Well, it's like, yeah, well, male and female sexuality is not the same thing.
It
So,
really depends on what the mechanism for it is, right? Because the mechanism
right.
for paraphilia is it's a target location error. So it really rests on whether or not autosexualities are a target location error, or is there another mechanism for why a sexuality would
Um,
inverse on itself?
so the target location error theory, it's an ideological theory about where autogynephilia and other sorts of attraction to being come from. I think that theory is correct, but we don't need that theory to say that these sexual interests clearly exist, and that they're not normal as well. They're in a small percent of people. And so since they're not normal and they're kind of uncommon and they're different from like procreative sexuality, they probably do count as paraphilias. And um but yeah, I think that something that um man, it's hard to just say Aaron. So yeah, some
Yeah.
Aaron T was saying is that basically male and female sexuality are different, right? And this is this is something I think about with the subject of autoandrophilia, in that just as male and female heterosexuality are different, and also homosexuality is different between the sexes, so too we should expect similar differences for autoheterosexuality. Just like the increased amount of sentiments that yeah, Aaron T was pointing out, because and I wish I had thought to write that into the book. Like once he mentioned that to me, I was like, You're so right, and I can't believe I didn't put that in the book.
Mhm.
Well, I
um,
mean, yeah.
yeah.
Sorry, go on.
No, no, I'm done.
Little
I'm done.
post. You're going to be putting a little insert, little post-it note or a bookmark into every copy of the book now before it
I
goes
just
out.
suggested a revision too here shortly, because I think yeah, we need to do a lot more studying of female sexuality, and yeah. So anyway, it could yeah, there could be a need for a revision down the line. Um, but I mean, the examples that you did choose were quite useful in that they very clearly highlight the the female equivalent of autogynephilia, with Lou Sullivan and Mr. G, etc. It's,
Mr.
they're
G.
very,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mr.
uh,
G's such a badass. Like, seriously, if anyone
uh,
wants to see the exploits of this fella, you can read Robert Stoller's Splitting: A Case of Female Masculinity. It's this thick book that is just basically a transcript between him and this one patient. It's about this one case. And my God, this female, I consider this person autoandrophilic. Stoller thought, they were homosexual because he didn't have the category of autoandrophilia at the time. But this guy would like shoot people for sleeping with his girlfriend. He'd like drag race, run over people with like a motorcycle. Like first time he like drove a car to school, it was one he stole. I think like just absolute toxic masculinity. Um, it,
definitely a troubled kid.
yeah, it's a very entertaining read. Like that. Yeah, I just wanted to spotlight Mr. G for a second because that dude was wild. And and yeah, there's those other examples like Lou Sullivan that thankfully he shared his diaries so that and people have gone through them and picked out basically the greatest hits and compiled them into various books. And so we can see firsthand now the inner thoughts of someone that is autoandrophilic and feels that strong sentiment towards being a man and specifically being a gay man, in his case.
Yeah, yeah. One thing that yeah, reading your book, when you were, so I guess I'll just come out and say it, as reading your book, I realized that I am autoandrophilic, in the sense of this very very kind of very personal, very as long as I can remember, drive, pull to be who I was attracted to.
Mm-hmm.
So not being able to differentiate. Well, obviously, so when I was young, and I would look up um, to men or older boys or whatever, and I just looked up to them. I thought they were cool. I wanted to be them, right? And I had I had this innate sense of myself as I was supposed to be male, right? So it wasn't like I wish it was you, but it was very much like I was just automatically self-identifying and projecting that I will grow up and I'll be like you. um, but then when I got older, post puberty, then it became, okay, I'm attracted to these people, but the stronger feeling was that I wanted to be them. So there was the same feeling of being attracted to, and envying, but the envy was much stronger than the external attraction, if that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense.
Makes
Um,
complete sense.
yeah, and so, but where for a long time I didn't believe that I was autoandrophilic when I learned what it was in comparison to the male equivalent, and also like reading your book. It was those case studies that made me go, I don't relate with this. It's not for me. It's never been very very sexual. It's always been very sentimental and very um, abstract and romantic, and like I don't. It's really I don't know. I guess I am not, or at least pre-testosterone. I was never a very sexually driven person, and so that could have a lot to do with it. I was a pretty low sex drive naturally, so I think that could have a lot to do with it, with me not identifying with the Lou Sullivans, or the like being turned on by putting on men's boots and jeans, and it's like I could never, no, that nothing like that has ever happened to me. But like um, but yeah, it's just much more a more subtle kind of yeah, an inability to differentiate who I wished I was and who I was attracted to. But the sex was just so, yeah, it's so far removed. I don't know. It's hard to explain this without, because it is a sexual orientation, but I don't know. It was very um I guess we can get more into like the sexual details, because I did obviously have the thing where I was engaging in heterosexual acts, but in my brain I was a man in that situation. But it was more like it was just how I could enjoy myself in that scenario. I wasn't like, I'm not turned on by the idea of being a man. It was just like in that scenario, sex is better. I don't know. It was like I could deal with my anatomy and whatnot if I imagined that. I don't know. Yeah, again, the concept of being aroused by being a man, that I never had that. There was never any autosexuality. Anyway, I've been rambling now because yeah, but
that's why I'm so fascinated by and interested in just having conversations about our experiences and the phenomenon with. But I'm really careful, trying to be careful to not collapse any of that down into labels just yet, because what am I trying to say? I mean, especially I think maybe my caution is as a clinician, I have to be careful about. I don't want to promote ideas of diagnoses that haven't yet been well established and proven. I mean, I can't do that professionally, but I'm definitely. But at the same time, I know that we develop new concepts. I mean, definitions of different phenomenon change all the time. So I'm definitely open and curious about the conversation and never want to shut down the conversation of the phenomenon. And I'm very like Micah Bailey when he talked about your book recently for a webinar with FAIR, propped up your book, Phil, and said it was a fantastic read. Even though he disagrees with some of the hypothesis. But I think like him, I'm very open-minded and very interested in having the conversation and really unpacking these experiences in the nuance and detail that we've experienced them. And but with any diagnostic label, it's so tricky because there's so many overlapping symptoms or experiences across different diagnostic categories. And so just because we have some experiences in common doesn't necessarily mean they belong in the same diagnostic category. And as you're talking, Aaron, about that sentimentality of you really identifying with men and having that sentimental feeling, I mean, how is that different from any man who really looks up and has role models and really admires and has sentimental feelings and admires the men in their life?
Because I'm not male. Like I was
right.
there was a confusion there,
Yeah.
Right. And also you mentioned like it being hard to differentiate between liking them and wanting to be them. Like that the wanting to be part was stronger, but that both were there and it was hard to tell what was going on.
And that's the question, right? Is what is the mechanism for that wanting to be the man? I mean, for me, I think it was different, but I think where there's some overlap between the autosexuality and what I think of as like the homosexual type, I think there's a lot, once it becomes gender dysphoria, I think there's a lot of similarities. I think maybe the impact of this incongruence or the gender nonconformity is maybe where these two things converge. And this is something that I discovered talking to Debbie Hayton or reading some of her description of her experience, is that as it becomes gender dysphoria, it seems to start to converge into a very similar experience. And one of the things that it converges on is the development of like this internal, almost like a splitting of self, that there's this creation of this kind of fantasy self that we become emotionally attached to. And that happened to me, though I don't think it was autosexuality. I think like I grew up in, have either of you watched Little House on the Prairie? I mean, is that?
Oh yeah.
So I mean that was common back in the day on TV, and at least in North America. But I basically grew up on the set of Little House on the Prairie. Like my childhood was a very sheltered, small town farming community childhood. Not that anything bad never happened or anything, but I mean, even a Little House on the Prairie, there's lots of different narratives, but my worldview was very narrow, and I loved that culture. I felt safe and contained, and I valued that culture. But I grew up, watching the show, let's say Little House on the Prairie or Girls in My Community, having crushes on the girls. And I had a zero framework for homosexuality within that worldview. And so I just grew up having crushes on like Laura Ingalls on Little House on the Prairie and feeling sentimental to the guys that, you know, she might be dating in the show, or girls were dating the guys. And it's like, oh, I'm so drawn and falling in love with these girls. I want to be what they're drawn and attracted to. So I really think that was my primary driver. Is I value my culture. I want to live within my culture. I want that kind of life. I'm drawn to these girls. They're drawn to guys. And I think subconsciously that was my primary driver. Is I want to be the thing that the girls I'm falling in love with are going to be reciprocating that attraction, and tried to do that to the best of my ability.
Yeah, and that's the kind of typical homosexual type. I just wanted to be what I was attracted to. I wasn't trying to attract others. You know,
Yeah.
that wasn't the motivation, you know.
So there is a kind of a sexual driver, but it's not like we're all just perverts. Like, it's this very deep, I think, unconscious drive, right? It's not.
Sure.
I think the cartoonish version of all of these things is we're all just perverts, and it's all just a surface level getting our rocks off, right? Like, it's where these are very deep internal drivers that are complicated, and they're about sexuality, but they're also about romantic love, and
yeah,
and
and
it's powerful.
Yeah, they're deeply woven into our psychology too. You know, heterosexuals tend to have a particular way of thinking that is different from homosexuals, and it's just because, you know, males and females have these different optimal reproductive strategies. So evolutionarily, there's different male and female psychologies, and then the development of sexual orientation seems to develop along with those things. And so, yeah, sometimes, like with homosexuality, people feel more comfortable just living as the other sex. And like you were describing growing up in like a farm community, how you wanted to basically be in the social role that made sense for being attracted to girls.
Yeah.
Right. And that was like an assimilating, like a way of integrating into that social network, which is I consider that that seems more of like the homosexual ideology sort of thinking, you know, whereas like the other one's just about like, man, I really want to be that thing, and I don't care if it makes me socially a homosexual afterwards, after transitioning. Like, I really want to be that thing.
Mm-hmm.
That is very that just occurred to me as a very distinct distinction between the two. Is so homosexual it's like a lot of the motivation is to be what, you know, to be what you're to attract what you're attracted to, whereas with the auto heterosexual transition, you're consciously making yourself unappealing to the sex you should be attracted to, right? It's very almost one is pragmatic, the other is very counterintuitive and not at all pragmatic.
I just want to throw in, like, I think people really underestimate, like, the vast majority of people are heterosexual, have a typical sexuality, and I think they really underestimate the degree to which sexual orientation drives social behavior.
I agree,
you know,
100%.
like when you're typical and everyone else is behaving the same way, it's like the fish in the water that doesn't recognize it's in the water, right? It just, our societies get built around this behavior in a way that it's like, that's just normal, that's just the way it is. And I think don't see it for that reason, because it is typical and it's mirrored everywhere. But so much of our society and social interactions are driven by our heterosexual sexual orientations. And I think it's only when a person has an atypical sexuality and that driver doesn't seem to fit into how our society is structured that it becomes highlighted and as a problem.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing I really wanted to talk about with you, Phil, is meta attraction. Yeah. I'm going to keep bringing this back to me because I've obviously had this realization recently, and I'm just now kind of being out and open about it. But one of the things that made me, again, not believe that I was autoandrophilic is because I do not have, or at least not consciously, I've examined this thoroughly. I do not believe that I have metasexuality. I don't. I was recently listening to your conversation with Corinna and Nina on Heterodorks, where you guys were talking about, you were describing metasexuality and this experience of like the other person is like kind of much of their appeal is to just to be to feed you back what you want to be, like to validate your sense of self as either male or female, and that's much of the sexual appeal towards uh, uh would be the opposite, no, towards the same sex. And you guys also said like that, I think Nina said something about like, where does, just basically losing yourself in, attraction to this other person's body, where does that come from? And you're basically like, so that's okay. So when it comes to again, I guess I can't really do this without oversharing, is that's how I experience sexual attraction to women. Is I completely like I'm not conscious of myself. It's very much very target driven and very uh yeah, just very much obsessed with her body, like it's not has nothing to do with me, which is weird, right? If it's autosexuality, that shouldn't happen. And then my attraction to men was, again, it wasn't target oriented. I never really cared that much about men's bodies. They didn't really appeal that much to me. But they just were the bodies of the people I was attracted to. And then, yeah, anyway, I'm not sure where I'm going with this, other than I feel like I fit all the molds of the autoandrophile or the autoheterosexual, but then my sexuality shifted with testosterone and became gynophilic and very, very external, very yeah, not at all meta, I guess, is the only way I can say this.
Right. Yeah,
Thoughts?
it's I think from the inside it's hard to tell apart meta attraction from conventional allosexual attraction. And so yeah, I'm kind of agnostic about like in your case what's going on. But I will say that like from what you described, your auto androphilia has always been stronger than your allo androphilia.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so that side of you I would expect to win out in like the inner conflict of these two selves. I would expect your autoandrophilic self to be the one that is mostly in charge of your self system and driving your thinking and behavior in terms of mating.
what? Yeah, and that does kind of jive with my lost attraction to men. Uh, like that when I lost that feeling of after I transitioned, I lost that feeling of envy toward men, and I simultaneously lost attraction to them. But I still have autoandrophilic dysphoria, right? And so I think you're right. I think my androphilia is entirely auto, like like I'm the only man I want, sort of, not to be weird, but like it's like I fulfilled that, I guess, by
You're the most
transitioning.
important man in your life.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
and yeah, my only allosexuality is a gynophilic, and again, from every perspective I've examined in my brain, it's entirely um, not meta and genuine. So
Right.
um,
Well, something I want to say is that like meta, it, sometimes people consider it not genuine attraction, but for someone that's particularly predisposed to auto heterosexual meta attraction, they wouldn't have any way of knowing that it's different from the other type of attraction because they don't have the conventional heterosexual attraction to a degree where they'd have something to compare it to. And so,
that's true. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I would love if meta attraction was studied more because I think it's a major contributor to bisexuality. In males, I think it's one of the most common reasons that males have sex with other males. And um and I think it's a smaller proportion of females' interest in other females, but I think that metagynophilia does happen to some autoandrophilic females and make them bisexual where they wouldn't be otherwise.
And I actually want to read a beautiful anecdote of this that I was just saw on my Twitter, and I think she might be a mutual of all of ours. But Maggie Oates and Mag on Twitter,
Yeah.
um, yeah. So she's someone else who's realized that her dysphoria is autoandrophilic as well, and she just posted this thread today. I'm going to read it just for people who the Mike Baileys out there who don't believe that this exists. But so she says, I want to talk about my pseudo bisexuality. I knew I had feelings for females and males, but by age 7 or 8, and I had started to conceptualize myself mentally as a male early on. Due to this, all of my relationships were experienced through the lens of my male identity. I've always sought out relationships where my masculinity would be validated, or I viewed myself as the boyfriend, even if in secret, parentheses. At one point in middle school, I told a girl that I liked her, but that I wouldn't make a move because I would only date you if I were a guy. I was still living as a female at this time. I've spent time wondering if this is internalized homophobia, but I don't believe it is. I had that thought as well at one point. I have zero sexual interest in any FF relationships. I only am attracted to females if I am able to view myself as male in relation to them. By 18, I recognized this and that I had been using women to accommodate my masculinity. I then stopped dating women because I believed this was unfair to them. I still have strong feelings for women, but only in the context of a male-female relationship in which I am the male. To illustrate, the more masculine I'm able to be around X woman, the more I am attracted to her, the more I'll pursue her. I can feel it turn a switch in my brain towards women. The desire and attraction to my own masculinity can sometimes outweigh X woman's physical appeal. I might not be attracted to X at first until I learn that I can be more masculine around her, and that's a good dynamic feeling for myself. If I ever knew that X was attracted to me as a female, i.e. she views me as a female, it would kill feelings for her entirely or instantly. Like,
right. Yeah.
that is 100. Like that is pseudo.
That is pseudo bisexual.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And she experienced it from like she said, like 6 or 7 when she first started having crushes because she already had developed this male sense of self prior to actual sexual awakening. That's why I think it's much more about sexual orientation than kink, or fetish, essentially. Yeah. Sorry, right. I went on another bit of a sidetrack there with why I conceptualize it thus, but yeah.
But no, I'm glad I saw the beginnings of that thread earlier and wanted to follow it up. But I didn't get around to it yet, so I'm kind of glad you read that because I was gonna get around to reading it. Yeah, that is a good example of how someone can think of themselves as male in their brain from a very young age, and then caused by autoandrophilia, and thus the only type of sexuality that makes sense to them is a heterosexual relationship, but it's where they play the cross-gender role.
Right.
And yeah, I think that's another great anecdote in support of the idea that, females can be autoandrophilic and experience metagynephilia.
We had and this has really solidified the theory that I had that had been brewing. So because female sexuality is so dynamic driven, I kind of had this sense that a lot of stone butch, and we touched on this, a lot of stone butch identities are the result of autoandrophilia that manifests as what entirely feels like genuine gynephilia. Then we had Laura, an AGP, on who basically had that exact same experience I described, but the male version. She at a very young age conceptualized herself as female, realized that this was shameful, and the only way that she could kind of self-conceptualize as female was to be attracted to boys. Like that was the only thing that would kind of like to keep the what we now know as autogynephilia a secret. It was like I can have crushes on boys because that'll be the me female doing that, and then because that started at such a young age, the androphilia became the actual dominant sexuality. Now, I didn't, and I feel like that I'm almost positive that happens in a lot of butch identifying lesbians. I think that there's obviously definitely like the proper HSTS female. Aaron, I think you fit that bill, but I think that there's also that that version of what I would have been if I wasn't so dysphoric about my anatomy. I would have done that. I would have pursued women to accommodate or to accentuate my sense of self as a male. But I found female anatomy so repulsive that I couldn't do that. But I think a lot of autoandrophilic females do that, and it's genuine, and it, like that the gynephilia becomes genuine. I was reading a paper that you sent me, Aaron, recently about I think you sent it a while ago, but I was reading it recently thoroughly, and it's about butch identity formation. And they were actually saying that in a lot of cases, the masculine gender identity develops first, and the gynophilic sexual orientation is an extension of the masculine sense of self. Now, they don't talk about autoandrophilia, but that to me is what that is. It's like you've developed a sense of self that is male, that is masculine, and your sexual orientation develops as an extension of that. I think that's probably quite common in same-sex attracted women, but not men.
Isn't that true of development in general, though? I mean, a little boy might act like a masculine little boy before he ever develops an attraction to two girls.
But he's male, right?
Yeah. But I think sexual orientation in general kind of plays out that way, though, doesn't it? That we're not overtly sexual as little children, and yet I do think if we can call it sort of pre-sexual orientation, because it feels creepy to say kids have a sexual orientation, but kids do, like what we were talking about, the development of social behavior. Kids do fall within the development of sexual behavior according to their sexual orientations, even though their sexual orientation hasn't fully developed.
Yeah, and it usually goes in a more direct route, right?
Yeah.
Than
it is. One of the things I've always
described and what I think is happening in a lot of autoandrophiles.
Yeah. I can see, it's so easy because I can see both sides of it, right? I mean, what you're saying makes sense, but I can also see sort of counter arguments for it, but that's what makes the conversation so rich. But I have met, a lot of butch lesbians over the years, and one thing that really fascinated me about the butch femme subculture is how it's a very romanticized version of male-female dynamics. It's like right out of like 1950s dating books. And that always frustrated me about it, because when I was growing up developing my sense of masculinity, it was based on the men in my life. Whereas a lot of butch lesbians seem to model themselves after a type of masculinity that it's almost like a nostalgic version of masculinity. Yeah, either the rebel James Dean or the 1950s family man. Like there's these very, very stereotypical types of masculinity that are very kind of nostalgia and romanticized versions of masculinity. They always seemed a little bit out of step with how actual men were behaving in our society.
Yeah, so something that I've been thinking about as we've been having this conversation is that it really brings up how it can be hard to tell apart the same-sex attraction that is ultimately caused by meta attraction versus the conventional same-sex attraction. And this means that, like, in reality, these sexual minorities that experience same-sex attraction, they're in the same communities and subcultures, but they have a different cause of their same-sex attraction. And it really shows how something I argue in my book is that when it comes to gender-based sexuality, there's two main types of queer. There's same-sex attraction, which is the LGB, and then there's the cross-gender attraction, which is when you're attracted to being the other sex, which is the main cause of the T and a common cause of the Q as well, in the political coalition. And so when we talk about these gender-based sexual orientations, it's really interesting that it can be hard to tell the line between the two. Like sometimes it can blur, even though these impulses are ultimately opposite in gender and direction. If someone has same-sex attraction, that's the opposite gender and direction from attracted to being the other sex, And so there's just this really weird situation where there's these two types of queer that commingle, and people have not been able to tell them apart because it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins.
It's a good point.
Yeah. just like, yeah, the different paths to gender dysphoria, different paths to
Exactly.
same-sex
Yeah.
attraction.
Right. And there's different
Yeah.
there might be different paths to autosexuality too. You know, like the erotic target location error theory is the leading theory. As far as I can tell, it's gonna be the leading theory for a long time. I don't see anything that can really compete with it. But I think it's important to keep our minds open to the idea that there might be different etiologies of autogynephilia or autoandrophilia. And so there basically there's this whole other level of like, you know, there's different etiologies of same-sex attraction, and then you go deeper and it's like there's even different
Mm-hmm.
etiologies of like homosexuality or autoheterosexuality itself.
Yeah, it's been
I,
fascinating.
I
Some of the gay men who historically, have admitted that they really have disliked and felt uncomfortable with gender nonconforming gay men, the more effeminate gay men, and now are coming to the realization that they actually have AAP, and that was maybe the driver of their, I need to be really masculine. And it's like, okay, so you basically bashed all these gay guys that were just gay and they didn't have AAP.
Yeah, and there's also something to be said for the fact that if they're attracted to men, they're likely attracted to masculinity itself, and so they'd want to
mm-hmm.
be that thing because that is to their brain what has sexual worth, you know.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I wanted to bring up, I think this is the last on my list, and that I kind of really want to talk to you about, was what because again, I love your book. I hope so many people read it, but I have one bone to pick with you, other than
Yeah.
the putting emphasis on the sentimentality that is, or the romanticism that is more the case with female sexual orientation. But and I don't think you really touch on this much in the book, but the ROGD phenomenon. And I've heard you talk about how, like, you obviously see the HSTS AGP, like those two exist in both sexes, or yeah, anyway, autosexuality. And I agree with you, but you're trying to ascribe that model to the Rajdi phenomenon, and I don't think that that's what we're seeing at all. I think, yes, some of those girls absolutely are going to be AAP, and some of them are going to be HSTS, just like since the beginning of all this. But I think I think the vast majority of those girls are just normal heterosexual girls who've been caught up in a political fad that gives them, a sense of personhood and a sense of community and a sense of righteous, self-righteousness, a cause and whatnot. It's group affiliation. It's all those things, and their attraction to the idea of being it's not they're attracted to the idea of being gay men. It's that they're girls who are attracted to boys, and if they're trans, that means they're like that means that they're a trans boy who likes boys. Is how it's not. It's the root of it isn't AAP. The root of it is normal heterosexual teenage girls conceptualizing their romantic attraction within the framework that they've come to put themselves in. I think that's one piece of it. I think another big piece of it is the appeal of like the slash erotica, right? The male pairing erotica that a lot of these girls
Yeah.
create and consume and whatnot. And I think a lot of that originated from absolutely autoandrophilia, no doubt about it. But I think the vast majority of young women who consume that stuff are doing so because it's safer. They're afraid
Yeah.
of heterosexual, like of actual men, right? And actually the heterosexual dynamic that they would be in, as a girl in a relationship with a boy or whatever, we're talking about young adults mainly, and that whole kind of genre of male love is their way of kind of projecting themselves, like their way of accessing sexuality in a very safe way that's kind of removed from themselves. It's also entirely what's the word, it's equal, that's not what I'm after, but it's
Egalitarian.
yeah, egalitarian, yes, in a way that
Yeah,
they
they're on the
obviously
same
haven't.
level.
Exactly, yeah. And I
Yeah.
think much of that kind of saying that, yeah, that kind of male erotica that you would interpret as AAP is really just a normal projection of a teenage girl trying to access sexuality in a, yeah. I think
In
it's,
a way that feels safer.
And
yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I want to figure that out, like if that is the case. And I think an important part of figuring that out is to look at trans men, female to male transsexuals, and say, how many of you are homosexual ideology? How many of you are auto-heterosexual ideology? And then figure out, look at the remaining ones that don't fit in and see how they compare, because like, while maybe I'm a bit bullish on thinking that AAP is the most common cause of female to male transgenderism.
I think
Um,
ideology is the most common cause of female to male transgenderism
so
currently.
you think like ROGD right now is currently over 50% of cases of that transition?
Yes, absolutely.
That's my hunch too.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think that the situation with the girls is very, very different. It's yeah, they're not motivated sexually. Like it's not a sexual thing for most girls. And I think and the phenomenon that we're seeing is a social contagion that has nothing to do with these girls' actual sexuality or gender identity. It's just a social category to belong to,
Right.
which is why it's so much more alarming to me. That I mean, I know a lot of these girls personally, these young women personally, and they do not have HSTS or AAP. They have
And they're taking hormones,
yes, and had top surgeries, and
and they're not, and they don't regret it.
there's no way that they couldn't. But you don't uh, Gender Wider Lens had a great episode on this. It's like how we deal with regret, and a lot of times when you've made an irreversible decision that you can't go back on, you
Right. You
don't.
don't
It's
question
not.
it.
Yeah. It's not a case of do I regret. Like you don't examine that. You just double down and
Yeah.
you propagate the ideology that got you where you are. And I think that's what we're seeing is we're seeing a multi-level marketing scheme of young women who were hurt by the same multi-level marketing scheme. Like I think that's what we're mostly seeing.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
something I
I mean,
disagreed with Michael Bailey in his talk with Fair recently. There was a question that came up about the influence of pornography in all of this, and he was basically saying, well, pornography doesn't change or create sexual orientation. It's just an illustration of sexual orientation. And I mean, I do agree with that to some extent. I don't think someone would go from being a heterosexual man to a homosexual man just because he watched gay porn. But I do think socially and psychologically, porn is having an impact on young people. I mean, I've heard both young girls and I mean girls, teenagers and young women, and very sensitive, emotional boys say they were absolutely terrified by male sexuality. Like male sexuality is as illustrated in pornography, and pornography is so easily accessible to anyone that has a cell phone. I think they really get terrified with just this, what they see as this like monster of aggressive male sexuality, and males not wanting to unleash that in themselves, and girls not wanting to be what they kind of perceived as themselves as the victim of that raw male sexuality.
yeah, it's intimidating probably to them to see that the pornography that's out there and then think I have to play any one of these roles that I'm seeing here.
Yeah, because I
Like,
mean, pornography is
Mm-hmm,
like a
mm-hmm.
total unleashing of male sexuality without any social mediation, right? I mean, in reality, when we are in love and married and in relationships and dating, and I think that rawness of that male sexuality gets kind of tampered by social norms and love and relationships, whereas
Well,
pornography
and the
is
sexual
it's just
appetite
all out
of a
on
woman, you know.
display. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
just all
yeah.
out on display, right? So it's not a very, I mean, it's realistic in the sense that, yeah, I mean, that is kind of male sexuality in its full on exposed form, but that doesn't mean that that is how it gets played out in every heterosexual relationship. So it's a real distortion in a way of,
right. Yeah.
yeah.
I I do want to figure out the ROGD thing. Yeah, like I said, I didn't go into it deep into my book because I personally feel that the evidence for AAP existing is more established than for ROGD. But I also, when I do look at the demographic, the sheer numbers of females transitioning now, it does vastly outstrip what you'd expect, based on, like females are homosexual or auto heterosexual at about half the rate that males are, right? So if it was strictly proportional to
That's true of
the
homosexuality too, isn't it?
right, yeah, yeah.
Sounds about right. Yeah.
Yeah, both of these, like males have these about twice as often. So if it was just these orientations without any social influence, we would expect there to be about twice as many um, trans women as there are trans men, right? And it used to be similar to that. It was like a 3-to-1 ratio, actually.
Mm-hmm.
But in recent years it flipped, and there's just so many females transitioning now, and it seems that the non-homosexual ones are the fastest growing subset of them. Like when I compared the reported sexual orientations between the National Transgender Discrimination Survey of 2011 and then the US Transgender Survey of 2015, when I did the typological sorting of non-homosexual and homosexual of the two sexes and broke it down into 4 groups, I found that the between 2008 and 2015, between these two surveys, the female proportion of total transitioners had gone up 9%, and the males had gone down 9%. And basically all the gain in the females was among the non-homosexuals in terms of the overall proportion of trans people. Like the non-homosexual trans men are the fastest growing subset as far as I can tell.
Yeah, because most girls are non-homosexual, but that
Exactly,
doesn't.
right.
And most girls are also auto heterosexual,
Right. It
right?
doesn't mean they're
Yeah,
AAP, but it's
right.
also like I think it's all the more important that we check for that, because to find out how many of these aren't either of the two types, because I think that's how we figure out how many are ROGD, like completely separate from the sexual causes, by just figuring out how many are actually caused by the sexual causes and then look at the rest.
See, and
Um,
I feel like it should be approached almost entirely differently because I feel like with girls, with young women, with females, let's say adolescent females is the demographic we're really talking about here. Um, I would think the more interesting question is how many of these are motivated by anything internal, and I think that figure is very small.
right,
And
right,
so whether it
yeah,
be it a gender dysphoria or sexual orientation, like, or the amalgamation of the two or whatever, I think that figure is very small. I think the majority of these girls are identifying as trans boys or non-binary for a myriad of social reasons. Aaron, I think you're bringing up the porn thing is a major contributor. Is like they do not want to be. So it's not just how like they're exposed to porn at like 9, 10 years old. Like they don't even know what sex is, and yet they're seeing the most, yeah, just this really really kind of aggressive and often demeaning, and just like it's not something that a young girl is going to be like, oh great, I can't wait to have a boyfriend. Like she's
Yeah.
not going to think that. She's going to be like, how the fuck do I not get myself in this situation? And I think transitioning out of being the target of sexualization is going to be a greater motivator for transition. But that's one of the I think that's one of the major motivators is transitioning as a decoy to hide. And that actually would be an internal motivator, I suppose. But the greater motivator, I believe, is still the ideological one. Is still girls in these massive bubbles of hyper woke online spaces where being anything cishet is a
it's
crime.
the worst. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And all you have to do is
yeah,
change your pronouns to they, them. When that no longer means anything, you go on a low dose of testosterone, and suddenly, it's a slippery slope. Like the trans identity is it's like a conveyor belt. It's like, okay, well, I've done this thing. I guess I need to do this thing now. Like this is literally they're not it's not it's not that it's subconscious, but they're not really examining the reason so much as I'm trans, so I do this.
right,
The
yeah,
next
and
step is this. The next step is
right,
this. And it's all about first identifying as trans. There's nothing internal that leads to it. It's just being cishet is bad, being trans is good, and these are the things I have to do to be trans. Like it's
I
it
think
sounds
Helena, Helena Kirchner
Yeah.
does a great job of articulating
Mhm.
that pathway for herself.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's just so many hundreds of thousands of Helenas. This is this is the major story, not the actual people who are transitioning to relieve something. I mean, that's obviously still a major issue and talking point, but I think the majority of what I'm calling an atrocity is what's happening to teenage girls in normal teenage development who are being medicalized because the psychologists who should be knowing what this developmental psychology looks like and what these stages of life mean for a teenage girl. Anyway, they're the same ones that are writing the hormone prescriptions and the surgery referral letters, and that's what's just so atrocious to me.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I
we went from
definitely,
AAP.
yeah.
Anyway, go on. Yeah,
No, you're on a roll today. Must have good coffee or something.
yeah. I
Um,
had a list.
yeah, no, I am concerned about how the postmodern gender memeplex, like the gender religion, how it's impacting girls, because it's it is being taught in schools, and thus they just trust their teacher, and everyone else is saying it, so then they think, oh, this is what sex and gender is, and then they get told that, oh, trans is this thing, and then if you're trans, that means you have to do, the medical
Mm-hmm.
stuff, or
Mm-hmm.
like it's kind of implied.
Yep.
And that's why I think it's so important to have it be widely known the two known sexual causes of
Yeah.
transgenderism, so
Yeah.
that these girls, if they learn about these two types and then realize I'm definitely neither one of these, then they can realize, oh shit, I'm actually not trans, and then
Mhm.
that might help them.
Exactly.
And it
I
doesn't,
would.
and it also helps take away the some of the prestige of trans within the progressive subcultures. There is like a cachet to that, and I think it would help a little bit if it was just something that if people understood that, like, hey, there's homosexuals and there's autoheterosexuals, and neither orientation makes a person better than another person or worse. It's just that they're just sexual minorities. And um yeah, and if you're not that, it's fine. But it like it doesn't make you more special to be one of them.
Mhm. I think kind of what I was going back to what I was saying about sexual orientation being such a driver for how societies organize themselves. I think this whole thing. I mean, if it weren't for the fact that so many people were being harmed and damaged, it's such a fascinating study on the different, really primary, powerful drivers of how groups and societies organize themselves. So I think what we saw with those with gender dysphoria is the power of sexual orientation to drive social behavior. But I think with the teenage girls, we're seeing the power of groupthink and belonging to groups. That the tribalism is another
Mm-hmm.
very powerful, equally
Powerful.
powerful to
Yeah.
sexual orientation for girls,
Mm-hmm.
to belong, right? To feel like they belong to a tribe. And I mean,
Yep.
the history proves that, right? I mean, groupthink as a driver for behavior has led to like riots and all kinds of weird behaviors, right? Cults and conspiracy theories. That certain
Yep.
ideas, when they hook into your need to belong and hook in, but I think the gender ideologies is hooking into very deep, unconscious needs, but different from sexual orientation needs. But then they have to figure out, okay,
Mm-hmm.
how do I now fit my sexual orientation into this
Mm-hmm.
group think and this other driver?
100%. Yep. I think Phil, one of them is a kind of you're crowing at this from sorry, but very male brained, right? It's like, oh, it's got
I
to be
can't help it.
you got right, you got to be it's got to be a sexual reason, like it's these drastic behaviors are driven by internal sexual motivations, and um I think with females, certainly adolescent females, the social motivations are 10 times stronger than sexual
Yeah.
motivations.
Which
And
is what
Yeah.
something,
Paul. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, something that I want to say is, like, maybe, since I'm human, part of why I am like hesitant to think that so many of these transitions are just due to social contagion is that, like, just what an atrocity that would be. And it's like
Thank you.
it's
That's
like,
where I've been for 6 years.
Yeah.
right, it's like, no, it's like I don't there's a very real human impulse that I want that to not be true. And
Mhm.
and so the the autosexual theory I'm in favor of, it can clearly account for some of these transitions. We're
Yeah,
disagreeing about how
yeah,
much it counts for, but it's some, you know. There
yeah.
are
And
like the
you've been in like the FTM spaces, and you're pointing out, stuff that like in the FTM Reddit and whatnot that's clearly motivated by autoandrophilia.
Yeah, you
Like it's
search for
definitely
the
there.
word
Yeah,
euphoria,
right.
search for ghost boners or phantom boners,
Hmm.
phantom
Yep.
dick. If you search for these search terms, you will find a lot of trans men online reporting that they experience phantom dicks, often in like sexual situations, or that they experience gender euphoria from being treated as a man
Yep.
or dressing a certain way. And when we see in the MTF subreddits them say that they feel gender euphoria, we're thinking, oh, that's AGP, right? And so that's why I just think it's kind of logical to conclude that if the females are also saying they experience gender euphoria and it's into the same types of classes of stimuli, then maybe it's just the female analog of autogynephilia.
And
Yep.
yeah,
And
I
I think
agree
it
with you
is.
that I have heard trans men and butch lesbians or lesbians in the past that have said that that's not something I've ever experienced, that phantom penis, but
Right.
I've heard people talk about it for sure. It does happen.
Right. And what do they say, what sort of situations it comes up in, or just that has happened?
Just that it happens, and I guess mostly in like sexual situations. Like
Right, exactly.
if they're using like a prosthetic dick and they're this is getting graphic, but if they're getting a blowjob using a prosthetic, that they
That they
actually
can feel it.
experience, they can feel it. They say that they can feel it and
Yeah.
they can actually have an orgasm from it.
Yeah, and I think that I I do believe that because I've tried to make sense of this phantom anatomy phenomenon, and as far as I could tell, it seems to be related to our brain's proprioception ability of like telling where our body parts are. Um, because like the otherkin, for instance, when they feel that they have, people that identify as animals and such, when they feel that they have like a big tail or wings or phantom wings or phantom tail, they report moving their body differently to account for the weight of such things and of trying to like unconsciously trying to like avoid hitting objects because their phantom anatomy would interfere with it. So there is this sense of like proprioception cross embodiment.
Hmm.
And so,
And
yeah, I
I've
guess,
heard of
yeah,
the autoandrophilia thing happening in non-sexual situations. We have again probably a mutual of all of ours, and we had her on the pod very early on. Cynthia, she used to have I'm not sure if she still does, but certainly when she was younger, she had like phantom penis in situations where it was like it was like she thought it was embarrassing. She was like, oh no, what if people see this?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
not sexual situation. It was very much like, yeah. Anyway, so that blew my mind. Yeah.
yeah. No, and that happens too. That the phantom shifts, the phantom anatomy, um, it they do it. It happens uncommonly often in sexual situations, but it can happen randomly at other times of life, and it can be so confusing, because like you're saying, there can be this girl that's like just trying to exist socially, and then she feels like she has a boner, and then she's like, "What if
Right.
people see?"
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, she was like in third grade or something too. It's like,
Hmm.
oh no.
Right.
Have you ever seen that study? Because you can trick that. Yeah, that your body map. There are
The
ways
right
that
hand illusion.
yes. So are you familiar with
Yeah.
that study, Aaron T, where they had like
Method.
a rubber arm, and so there was like
Mhm.
this
Yep,
blinder, and then they have the rubber arm, and then
yep.
so all you can see is like the rubber arm, and then they're doing things to your actual hand, or is that how? No, they're doing
Right.
things to the rubber arm, and you actually feel it,
Yeah,
and as if
they cover your right shoulder with a blanket, and so that and put your left hand on the table, and they have this fake right hand on the table that's like going into your shirt sleeve where it's resting where your hand would be, and then they brush both of your hands with little brushes at the same time so that your brain sort of like syncs up that like, oh, both these hands are mine, you know and then um yeah, and then that fake hand becomes part of your body map temporarily.
mhm.
And one of the most interesting studies in my book. I wrote a whole subsection on it in the furry chapter. Is at a furry convention, some people brought in furries and did this right hand illusion experiment with them, and then compared how, like, when this illusion takes place, they have an inner sense of where their hand is, and how much ownership they have over that hand, and they compared this furries experience to a sample of people that were not furries, just a general sample, and they found that furries had less of a sense of ownership over that hand, and that this lower sense of ownership over the hand was correlated with furry role play, with the frequency and intensity of furry role play, and with other furry embodiment phenomena. So basically, the more they did furry stuff, the less they identified with the hand, and also the less they thought of humans. They also had more favorable sentiments of animals and thought less of humans. The less that the illusion worked on them.
Interesting. I wasn't familiar with that body of research.
Yeah, I found it fascinating because when I got into learning about trans species stuff and they talk about the phantom anatomy all the time, I realized that this phantom anatomy and also the mental shifts they talk about, that if this happens with trans species identity, and we see something similar happening with the gender identity where people experience phantom boobs and phantom dicks and things like that, then maybe it's a similar mechanism causing them.
See, and I don't know. The hand thing makes sense. You know what it feels like to have a brush your right hand, right? And so like that to me is easy to, not easy, but like you can understand, like what that sensation is. It's easy to imagine it's happening when it's not happening, and you're just looking at it because you've felt that before. It's like somebody who's never had a boner, like I never had a penis, does not know, like it's there's nothing to compare. Like there's no reference point. There's no memory of this feeling to superimpose on the current situation.
Well, if they've ever seen a male have a boner,
Well, yeah, sure, but I don't know. But
then
like the personal sensation, it's like, yeah, I imagine obviously you can think about it, but to have it subconsciously happen and to have it, I don't know.
yeah,
I'm just thinking like it seems very different to have the sensation that you have a body part you have never had. That seems like different than like feeling a sensation on a sensation that you have felt before and you're mistakenly having it now. Like it does feel like a
right.
different.
There is
I do
some,
think they are different things.
yeah, there is some evidence that gender dysphoria is related to like a malfunction in that body mapping, in that body mapping wiring. There has been, some sort of investigation into that connection of
Right.
body ownership and gender dysphoria. It's hard to
Yeah,
say if that's a symptom or a cause, though.
exactly. And like I'm pretty behind the theory that the autosexuality is the ultimate cause of the body mapping dysfunction, because if you have this thing that makes you have the sensation of being the other gender in various ways, and then that will conflict with your reality of what your sex is, and that'll create an incongruence between the two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For me, it was. I've talked about this a lot. For primarily in my chest, it was just like the opposite of phantom. It was like this should not be. Like these should not be here. It's very much like a foreign body part attached to me was the
Yeah,
sensation.
I had the
Right,
same
like your chest
experience.
should have ended like
Yeah.
at like
Right.
the
Right.
flat
Yeah.
part, and that this extra protrusions were just alien things that should not be there.
Yeah,
Right.
because normally
Yeah.
when you have a body part amputated, that's when you feel phantom sensation, right? And I never experienced phantom sensation having my breast removed because it brought it into alignment with how my body had already mapped my chest. So for me, it
Right.
was like the removal of these cancerous growths, right? That were actually contrary to my body map.
Yeah. And I think that's a different type of phantom than the autosexual like when you're talking about like amputation phantoms, I think that's a different cause than the autosexual phantoms. And
No,
so
but
I
he's
think it'd be
saying
cool.
after the body part's been removed, though, you'd think.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
like if my body had mapped having a body part like breasts, then having
Yeah.
them removed could have created phantom sensations, right? Just like
Right. But it
any
didn't for you.
amputee, but it didn't for me because my body hadn't mapped in a way that accommodated them. So having them removed didn't create phantom sensations for me.
Right. Yeah. It's yeah, I'd definitely like to know more about this, about like when like basically the different ideologies of phantom sensations. You know,
Mhm.
because it's clear that there's multiple roads to this sensation as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Anything else we want to go over? We've already elapsed an hour. We tried to keep him to about an hour. I knew we'd probably go over on this one, but I've really got to pee.
Uh, um. Uh. Could I like for a few minutes like
Yeah,
explain the book? Because
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
so bad. I'm so bad. I'm so bad at promoting.
yeah.
So okay, the book is called Autoheterosexual, Attracted to Being the Other Sex. It's about cross-gender attraction. Most of us know about same-sex attraction. This is about the other type of queer. This is about when you're attracted to being the other sex. It is straight, turned inside out. It's heterosexuality pointed at yourself. And I consider it the most common cause of transgenderism. And so I wrote this book, and I think it's important because people are getting surgeries without knowing which of the two types main like classes of gender dysphoria they have. And there's also plenty of people that were like I used to be, that are just privately confused about their gender feelings, like why do I feel this way, it doesn't make any sense. And it doesn't have to be this way. They can just have it explained to them that hey, you're a sexual minority, here's what it is, how it works, there's nothing wrong with it. You know, make the choices that you think will lead to your greatest flourishing in life. But like to do that, it helps to understand what your actual situation is. And so, yeah, basically, I wrote Autoheterosexual because I just wanted to help a lot of people stop being confused about gender and to try to reduce the ideology in conversations about transgenderism, because people are fighting over their imaginary ideas of what the phenomenon at play here, when there there are known causes of this that are just not being discussed. And I also want to help the broader autosexual population with, because there's, you know, people that experience trans species identity and are confused about it. There's people that experience trans race identity, and everyone shits on trans race people, but I think they're fine. I think trans race is legit, and that we should be nicer to them. And I want them to also understand there's nothing wrong with being attracted to being a particular race. Um, Basically, I want a bunch of sexual minorities to understand their situation properly and accept themselves as they are without apology, so that they can just be their strongest, best selves.
And I know I've been kind of critiquing your theories and a lot of this, but if anybody's listening, on the first time we had Phil on, it was just to praise the book, because I read it, yeah, when you first gave it to me, and yeah, it's a wonderful book. It certainly helped me. Like I learned about myself reading it, and yeah, it's a really good book. I was just Today was my opportunity to be like, oh, but I also thought about this. So,
Right. And
but
I'm
yeah,
glad you did bring up that stuff, because yeah, sometimes critique's important. If someone's wrong, it's good to critique that to get the truth. And you might be right that the social contagion stuff is a bigger role. But I'm glad that you personally found benefit in my depiction of autoandrophilia, and I'm glad that you came out too, because that takes chutzpah to come out as one of these orientations for some reason.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Along doing these conversations, you get the impression that there's a good type of dysphoria and a bad type of dysphoria,
right.
and I was like, I'll own the bad type of
They're all
dysphoria.
bad types. Like
Yeah,
it's suffering. Like let's
yeah,
try to
yeah.
reduce the suffering.
Right, right. Yeah. Well, thank you
Yeah.
so much for being here with us again, Phil. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And everybody, read Autoheterosexual or Autoheterosexuality, Attraction to Being the Other Sex.
I hope it flies off the shelves, Phil.
I hope it does too. Yeah, it comes
Yeah.
out this Pride, just Very appropriate. June 13th, everyone. You can go to autohetbook.com to sign up for a reminder. You can also go to my Twitter where I've posted the first 12 and counting chapters. I'm posting the whole damn thing. I'll probably leave out the trans age chapter, but like I'm going to post all the other chapters. I'm going to post 35 of the 36 chapters to Twitter so that's accessible to everyone and so that it can foster public debate. And
we'll link a master one below. If you can send that. Yeah. Along with the link to the website. So.
Okay. Cool.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Take care.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Transparency Podcast. If you enjoy our content, please help out our algorithm by hitting like or subscribe. If you'd like to make a donation, follow the link to our PayPal account. On behalf of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, thanks for your support.